Zurlo, welcome to Apollos Watered.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Yeah, you say that on all the podcasts, don't you?
I absolutely do. But it's absolutely true every time.
Is there ever one you're like, what happened? Why did I do this? What was wrong? I had no idea what this would be like.
No, sometimes I say it after the podcast is over, but normally in the beginning, I feel great.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to start off with the Fast Five. Are you ready for the Fast Five?
I'm scared, but I'm ready.
Okay. This isn't to be scared about. Just reading a bit about in the introduction of your book, you mentioned being a mother to two young girls. So 2 daughters, right?
Yes, that's true.
So here's my question. What is the one video, if they're allowed to watch videos, that you would be happy if it were over today and they never watched it again?
Okay, this is a very hard question to answer because my kids have a large age gap between them. So I have a 6-year-old and a 13-year-old, and they're not watching the same stuff.
Okay, let's go with the 6-year-old. Let's go with the 6-year-old.
I would be happy to leave everything Barbie behind. I don't want to hear any more Barbie. Barbie was great when it was just dolls. When Barbie got on TV, so annoying. I just stick with the dolls and the new dolls that are all like, racially diverse and body size positive, all good. But man, Barbie on video, so annoying.
Every parent has that video their kids are listening to. You're like, for me, there was the Wiggles. I mean, because my kids are a little older. So I just remember singing "G'day Squirrels" because they were like visiting Central Park, New York. And I wanted to get rid of that song so bad. Anyway. All right. How about this? Number 2, to relax. I love to blank. What?
TikTok.
Seriously?
I love TikTok. That is the thing I do. Yes.
Gina, come on.
When I need to decompress, I'm on TikTok. I've never posted a single video, but I'm scrolling.
Wait, okay. Just as an aside here, you just told me that you've been appointed to what position right now in Harvard? Tell me that.
I'll be a Yang visiting scholar in world Christianity at Harvard Divinity School, and I love TikTok.
I love it how those two go together. That's our world today. I cannot do TikTok, but I don't know. I'm just too old, I guess. I can't even do anything.
It's fun. It's very interesting.
Oh, no, I'm good. I'm good. I'm happy for you. I'm so happy for you, though. Okay, because you're a scholar. I mean, you are a scholar, and you have written the book on all these stats. You were a scholar in world Christianity, respected the world over. My question is, you've traveled to different parts of the world. I mean, we're Facebook friends, so I've seen some of the posts you've had at different places you've eaten. So, what is the craziest food you have eaten?
Yeah, I do tend to post a lot of food when I travel. I probably post more about food than I do anything else when I'm overseas with Christians all around the world. People love food. It brings everyone together.
It does.
So I'll give you 2 examples. One, and not to offend any of our guests from any of these places. I had some pizza in Brazil that was very confusing to me. There were toppings on this pizza that I did not think should be on pizza, like tuna and corn and things that we generally do not put on pizza. So that was a little bit strange. But even stranger than that was when I was offered horse in Mongolia.
Horse?
Yeah, that was a little tough for me. Horse. And like the organs of the horse, different pieces of the horse.
Really?
As a mean of respect for me, the guest in a particular place.
Did you eat it?
No, I couldn't do it. I felt so bad, but I just couldn't. I couldn't do it. I was very apologetic, but it was too much for me. Couldn't do it.
When I was a student and undergraduate, we had a class in biculturalism, and the final exam, the professor's like, "You don't need to study, you just need to show up." And everybody's like, "What?" And he comes in, and it's balut, the Filipino duck egg that's been fertilized.
Oh yeah.
With the beaks and and that was your final exam. You had to eat it.
I would have failed.
We didn't fail it. I think you got to see if you didn't eat it, but because they talk about eat whatever is set before you, but I can't. There are certain times I'm just like, I don't know if I can do it. Lord, give me strength to eat this. I don't
Well,
know.
also in Mongolia, they offered me a certain kind of milk and said about half of the world's population has the enzyme to digest this milk, and about half doesn't. Would you like some? And I said, I don't love those odds, so I'm gonna pass. And they were like, that's fair. Most white people can't digest it. And I thought, okay, this is not a culturally insensitive thing at all. So everyone's good.
Oh, so Scott Moreau was on, missiologist, and he actually mentioned Mongolia. I said, what's the crazy? I asked him this similar question, and he said, craziest thing I've ever eaten was fermented mare's milk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That
was it. And he goes, that's when the party started. That's what he said, because it got a little crazy. It just got a little crazy. Because, again, missions, you always are encountering different cultures. You just never know. You never know. But you're right. Food brings people together, and that's what I love about it. Now, because you've traveled, I want you to think of a place you haven't gone. If you could go to one place around the world right now, it would be where and why?
I would love to go to West Africa. I've not been. And there's so much interesting religious culture happening in West Africa. And Nigeria is a huge player in the current world Christianity and the future of world Christianity. So I'd love to, Nigeria in particular, I'd love to go there and meet with people and talk to people and get that on the ground experience of what life is like there.
I've not been to Nigeria. I've been to Liberia, but I always love the different cultural parts of Africa that have all the different styles and fashions. In Nigeria, for those are my Congolese listeners, I have a lot of friends, but they have the coolest clothes in Nigeria. They have the coolest colors. When I travel around Africa, I can see, I'm like, he's from Nigeria because he just looks good.
Yeah.
He has
I believe
fashion.
it. Yeah.
It's crazy.
The women, they're just astoundingly beautiful. And the color, so much color, what they wear, I could never pull it off. Too pale. But it's amazing women, and the patterns and the colors, I love it.
Me too. I had a guy, he wasn't African, but he was, dark skin. He's African American. And he was at church when I was a youth pastor years ago. And he comes in and it's like fluorescent orange. And I was like, you can pull that off. I would look like a big giant creamsicle. Yep. I would look so bad, but you look so good with it. The bold colors. I just love how the cultures, different cultures that have those different colors. I just love it. It's just beautiful. I wish I could pull it off. Okay, last question. If I were to be any city in the world, not the United States, it would be what and why? Not visit. You would be this city.
Be it?
Be this city.
What kind of question is that?
That's a great question, Gina. It's a great question.
How do you be a city? Okay, let me
you could be a store, a car. This is the part of the fun. It's the fun part, Gina. It's the fun part.
I'm a quantitative sociologist. I don't think
this
kind of thing. I need facts and figures and data. Okay, so let's say, I don't know. Okay, let's say, it has to be outside the United States. Let's say Edinburgh, Scotland. Edinburgh, Scotland is like a fairy tale city. And I just love that it's got all these combos of old and new kind of juxtaposed together. It's a very complex place. So if I were Edinburgh, Scotland, I guess I'd be drinking whiskey, wearing tartan, and kind of taking a view.
Playing the bagpipes and eating haggis?
Yeah. Have you ever had haggis? Don't knock it.
No, I want to though.
Good.
I do. I really want to. I had the historian Carl Truman on the show, and I asked him what's his non-academic hobby, and he's like, well, I gave my wife a choice. He goes, it was blues guitar or the bagpipes. She chose blues guitar, but I would love to play the bagpipes.
Yeah, they're amazing.
I would love to play the bagpipes. It's my favorite accent to imitate. I love to imitate Scots people. I actually love it. I could preach like this all day long if I could, but my kids are always like, Dad, please stop. Just stop. Just stop. All right, well, let's get further into this. Let's hear a bit about your bio. I want to know who you are and how you get into, you even said quantitative. Did you say quantitative, not qualitative?
I did.
Okay,
Yeah.
Quantitative analysis, being a scholar in world Christianity. How in the world did you get that? How'd you come to faith? And what led you to that? So let's hear that.
Yeah, so I will say most little girls growing up do not say, I want to be a quantitative sociologist when I grow up. So it wasn't like I had this lifelong dream to end up where I am today, but there were lots of different things along the way that kind of led me in this direction. So I am fourth generation Italian American from New York. All my great grandparents came from Italy, grew up with a very strong Italian American culture, but we were also Protestants, so Protestant Italian Americans. My grandfather got saved watching a Billy Graham crusade on TV. Got down on his knees in front of the TV and gave his life to Christ, and that kind of had rippling effects throughout my family. But when I got to Gordon-Conwell to do my master's degree, I really was questioning a lot of the Christianity that I was raised with, kind of a more fundamentalist, narrow road kind of Christianity is what I was raised in and what I'd been exposed to. But when I got to Gordon-Conwell, I bumped into, by accident, the Center for the Study of Global Christianity. And learning about global Christianity just blew open the doors for me, not just professionally, but personally. Because even though I had always kind of been curious about other places around the world, even when I was young, I was curious about other religions. I loved, remember the Animaniacs, that show from the 90s?
Yeah.
And Yakko had that song about the countries of the world. I loved that song. I just listened to it over and over and over again because there were all these places in the world that I had never heard of or I knew nothing about. And I thought, this is awesome. So I loved maps and all kinds of stuff. And so when I got to Gordon-Conwell, I started to learn kind of the religious side of that, and all the different expressions of Christianity all around the world was so interesting to me personally, that you can be a Christian in all these different ways. You don't have to be a Christian in the very specific way that you were raised. Christianity is so diverse ethnically and linguistically and theologically and culturally. You can find your own way in world Christianity based on how you were created, your personal experiences, how you interpret the scripture, all these kinds of things. And so it really helped bolster my faith to consider myself part of this global Christian family.
That is awesome, especially the global part, because I have a very similar story, but because you were an Italian, I didn't know this. My wife is Sicilian.
Okay.
I mean, she's, well, not from Sicily, like her family came over, third generation. I have to ask this question. I would have put it in the Fast Five had I known this. How do you do your sauce? And do you call it gravy?
My grandfather called it gravy, but we now call it sauce.
Okay.
And it has to be, I mean, I'm not like crushing tomatoes with my feet the way in the country. Let's not get crazy ideas.
What do you put in your sauce though? What do you put in your sauce?
Crushed tomatoes or puree, and then paste and all the different spices.
But you don't do like, see, my wife does
meat in the sauce.
My wife does hard-boiled eggs.
That's because she's from Sicily. It's okay. It's okay.
Oh, so her grandmother put in like whole chicken, Italian sausage, meatballs.
Yeah, you gotta have the sausage and meatballs. Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, it's just, otherwise it just tastes acidic. Once you put the meat in there, that's what really gives it all of its flavor. And you let it sit all day. The Sunday sauce. You gotta let it sit all day. That's the key.
Okay. That's right. Sorry. I had to take on that journey because I always want to know how people, I'm like, because I married into this. So my wife's side is Italian. So I'm always like, okay, is this really the Italian experience of every Italian? I mean, how do they differ between people? But that helps me out a little bit. All right. So let's get to a little bit of this Global Christianity, a guide to the world's largest religion from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe. This is filled with information, incredible information. What led you to write this book? I mean, you've written other books that are much more dense, much more expensive, and much more big. This seems more of a guide to regular non-academics. Would that be the right term, or am I missing?
Absolutely. Yes, that is absolutely the audience for this book. And that was the motivation for this book, was to get high quality, researched, reliable information on Christianity around the world into the hands of normal people. Because normal people are not going to read my 1,000-page hardback encyclopedia of world Christianity. No one's going to read that. And that's totally fine. And I don't mind. So I created a baby version, a paperback, interesting maps, charts, graphs, and stuff written in a way that's meant to be accessible for regular people to say, hey, my church is doing a mission trip to Kenya. what is Kenya? What's going on in Kenya? You can open the book, go to Kenya, and you get a brief overview of, oh, here's the kinds of Christianity that are there. Here's a little bit of the history of Christianity in Kenya. Here are some of the things I should think about if I'm going to go to Kenya. It's made with that idea in mind.
Okay. And it's relatively, I mean, it's just came out. It's not been out that long.
That's right. And you can buy it on Amazon for only like $25. So the goal is to really get it into the hands of people who need good information. There's a lot of bad information on the internet. Like you want to Google Christianity in Kenya, you're going to get all kinds of stuff, some of it good, some of it bad. And you might not know how to sift through what's right or wrong or what's well-researched, what's not. And so I've kind of collated all that for you and simmered it down to what I think are the most important things you should know about a place today.
So you're telling me that I can't believe everything that I read on the internet?
Please do not believe everything that you read on the internet, please.
I heard that quote too. I think Abraham Lincoln said that.
Yes.
I
read it on the internet.
I'm like, I remember seeing that. Don't believe everything you read on the internet, Abraham Lincoln. I'm like, that's so true. Because it is right. There is so much bogus stuff out there today. I mean, the internet is a great blessing, but it's also, it's exhausting to have to sift through what's real and what's not. Yeah. And this is why I wanted to highlight your work, because I know the amount of research, the study, the immensity of scholarship, and how it's not just people armchair guessing. This is serious data that people out there can look at, and anybody can really get into. But let's start off. Let's break it down here. Let's start off with the categories of religion. This is the part, even in the beginning, you really lay out your terms, you give it an immersion into it. I don't even think people are often think about this, but you simplified it. So how many categories of religion are there?
So we track 18 categories of religion. So that's Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, so on and so forth. So we have 18 categories, including atheists and agnostics. There's just no good category to include them both, even though they're technically non-religion. So there's 18 categories of religion. That's the top level of our taxonomy. And then it goes down from there.
Okay, so we have the 18 categories of religion. And even that, I mean, you're talking about all these major world religions, and they're found all over the world, or just some of them are in different parts of the world. I mean, is that, how do you even quantify that? That's just crazy to me.
Yeah, so we have a massive data collection mechanism that we have a whole team of research assistants who are constantly scouring all the best information. So there's three major sources of quantitative data on religion. The first is government censuses. So people check a box on a census, whether you're Christian or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or whatever. And then there's social scientific surveys and polls, which are happening all over the place all the time, asking people what religion they are, how often they pray, how often they go to church, things like that. And then what we're doing is collecting data from religious communities themselves. So Christians who have membership roles, who give data to their denominational heads, things like that. And then we're taking all this information in and weighing how good or bad each of the sources are to come up with our own best estimates for the size of every religion in every country of the world.
So with this information that you have, who is using, I mean, give us some groups that are using your material. I mean, yes, we know denominations and things like that, but what about like news agencies? Are they tapping into what you're using too?
Yes, anytime anything religion related happens on the global scale, we're getting a call from the New York Times, from the BBC, from the Washington Post, from Christianity Today, from all different kinds of news outlets, both secular and religious, saying, hey, what's the context that this is happening in? So for example, when the Pope resigned, my phone was ringing off the hook when the Pope resigned, because everyone's like, what's going on in global Catholicism? And who do you think the next Pope is going to be? Where's he going to come from? So all these global events that religion is involved in some way, we're there to provide kind of that long-term analysis of, hey, here's how that religion has changed over time in that country, or here are the projections for what it might look like in the future.
So let me ask you this, because you've got your finger on the pulse of global Christianity, the thing that I really want to know about, yes, you have all these research assistants, but not everyone's writing in English. How many of these different, I mean, how do you find out what people are writing in different languages? I mean, just that is exhausting.
Yes.
So how do you do all that? How do you find out what they're publishing in their different languages?
Yeah, so we do research in other languages as much as we possibly can. So part of that is bringing on native speakers to our team who speak key languages like Spanish and Chinese and things like that. Also, frankly, the tools have gotten a lot more sophisticated. Google Translate is a lot better than it used to be, and you can translate pretty much every website into English. Google Lens, you can use your phone to put it up against different languages and it'll instantly translate it for you. But also the thing that we do is we travel. And that's why I travel so much, is because you go to a place to find what those resources are that aren't available online or aren't available in the English speaking world. So travel is a huge part of what we do, not just because we love it and we love the culture and the food and all that, but it's critical to the method itself. I know what's happening in Mongolian Christianity because I've spent time with Mongolian Christians who have given me information that is not widespread outside of Mongolia.
What do you do with people that don't have the language that's written? I mean, that's just, or it's orality based.
Yeah, we do our best to provide estimates for those kind of tough situations. And that's why working with missions and missionaries is really important too. Who are the Christians working among groups that are orality based? It's missionaries. And often missionaries, they know what's happening on the ground, often more than a government or a survey or a census could ever know what's happening on the ground. They have that nuanced perspective. So we get a lot of information from on the ground missionaries. And then we are always sure, especially with sensitive context data, to present it in a way that no one would ever be identified or put into danger in any way.
Wow. Sorry, I was geeking out to my audience. They're probably like, why are you talking about all this right now? It's because I love it. I love this. Okay, let's delve into the Christian traditions.
Okay.
You mentioned early in the onset, what you studied this because you saw how Christianity was expressed in different parts of it. How many different Christian traditions, and I feel like I have to brace myself for this because there's going to be a huge answer. How many Christian traditions are there? How many did you include? And what made you include them as a tradition?
So it's actually a small number, depending on how you think
It
of
is?
it.
Okay.
So we identify what we call 4 major Christian traditions, which are Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants, and Independents. So only 4. But within those 4 major Christian traditions, we estimate there are 45,000 denominations in the world. So that's the big number. But also keep in mind, there's 2.5 billion Christians in the world. So there's a lot of Christians in the world, but there are a lot of denominations. And part of the reason is kind of the 2 sides of a coin. So one is when missionaries went and planted churches all around the world, a lot of those churches disinherited indigenous Christians. So the indigenous Christians weren't allowed to have leadership positions or all these different kinds of things. So indigenous Christians, such as in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, they broke away from the mission-founded churches to start their own denominations. And they did it because they wanted to be Christian in a way that made sense for them culturally. So that makes sense. So that splintering has happened quite a lot. And in doing so, we have all these denominations that make cultural and linguistic sense in that context. And that's a good thing. But the other side of the 45,000 denominations coin is theological disagreement. It's just Christians who can't get along on all different kinds of things. Some quite serious, like the role of women in your denomination or the role of LGBTQ people in your denomination. And some of it is rather trivial, like the color of the carpet or what time the church service is going to be or something frivolous like that. So we have lots of reasons why there are so many different denominations in the world. Some, in my opinion, more legitimate reasons than others.
Understandably. With that 45,000, I mean, you compiled the stat on this. I'll wait. Can you name all of them? Just go ahead. You can start
How much time do we have? I can start with the letter A. And
45,000. Okay. So all those traditions, which is the biggest one?
Catholics.
How many?
About 1 billion. About half of the world's Christians are Catholics.
And so then the second largest would be roughly?
Protestants.
Okay.
And then Independents and then Orthodox.
So Orthodox are the smallest. How many Orthodox flavors are there?
Well, there's two major branches. So there's Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox. So the Orthodox Church is just structurally different because it's more aligned with ethnicity and history and culture. So within the Eastern Orthodox, you have all the different flavors: Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, Belarusian, Romanian, Greek. And then within Oriental Orthodox, you have, say, the Ethiopian Orthodox, the Eritrean Orthodox, so on and so forth. So it kind of matches the ethnic community.
Wow. I spent a year going through the Orthodox Study Bible, just wanting to learn more, to understand how did we get our canon, how, theirs and their shape, because I do want to understand Christianity around the world, to see how it's different incarnations and what it looks like. But when you get into the different Christian traditions, you even have another subgroup, and forgive me if I'm not classifying this right, but you have different Christian movements.
Yes.
Within that. Would that be right? What are these Christian movements?
Yes. So within the four major traditions are two movements. One is the evangelical movement, and the second is the Pentecostal charismatic movement. And the reason we call them movements is because they're found within the major Christian traditions. So you can be, for example, a Catholic charismatic, or a Protestant evangelical, or an independent charismatic, or independent evangelical charismatic. So there's overlap between the movements and the traditions. And that's where some of the complexity comes out in world Christianity of who is an evangelical, who is a Pentecostal, who is a charismatic. So we're wrestling with all those kinds of discussions as well.
Well, when you get into that, how do you identify? Because that's the question I get when I talk to people about stats, and they want to know how many Christians are in the world. Inevitably, they want to know about certain sex groups, cults that have been classified. Mm-hmm. And usually, I remember talking to Todd Johnson about this, your colleague, and he was mentioning that you allow self-identification because it's too difficult for your quantitative purposes to go through the different aspects. So is it that self-identification fills you in that stat? Is that how that works? That they identify as Christian, or do they not identify as Christian, even though they might be, like Jehovah's Witnesses, for example? Mm-hmm. Where do they fit in there?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fabulous question. And it's a question everyone should always ask whenever you see statistics. What is the definition of the thing that they are describing statistically? Ask the questions, scrutinize the data, be a little bit skeptical, and then do your homework to find the answer. So it's okay to ask those kinds of questions of data, even my own data. Ask the question, what do you mean by this? Who are these people? So because we are social scientists, we are using self-identification as our measuring stick for all religions in the world. If I were a theologian or a biblical studies scholar or something else, I might use a different measuring stick. So if you self-identify as a Christian, you are a Christian. So that means groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, they self-identify as Christians. So therefore we include them as such. I'm not going to make any theological statements about who's, quote, in or out of world Christianity. That's someone else's job, frankly.
You're just looking at the quantitative, just from a self-identification for sheer statistical analysis, not a theological junction or any type of theological parameters put within these.
That's correct.
But you're not only looking at global Christianity. I mean, yes, I know you're examining global Christianity, but you also see other religions too. And do you see that when you're identifying, like Islam, when you're looking at Islam, I mean, of course you have the Sunnis, the Shias, and then Sufis, which is kind of another kind of group into that. And then you have kind of the folk Islam. Do you use the same type of criteria for describing them? Because other Muslims would say, okay, that's not a Muslim. And you're like, well, they identify as such.
Yes, we use the same self-identification tools as we do for Christianity for other religions as well. So if you self-identify as a Muslim, you're a Muslim, even if this particular school of Islam doesn't think your school is, quote, real Islam. Because global Islam is just as diverse as global Christianity is. Islam in Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim country, is way different than Islam in Saudi Arabia, the home of Mecca and Medina. They're just different kinds of Islam, much like Christianity in Saudi Arabia and Christianity in Indonesia are really, really different. So that's why taking the self-identification route kind of protects us a little bit, frankly, from making statements, making qualitative judgments. I don't want to be in the business of making judgments on people's faith or the practice of their faith. I'm not interested in that. I want to describe who they say they are and where they fit in the global picture. That's what I want to do.
Okay, so that makes it a bit more objective though across the board, because you're applying the same criteria through every, I mean, it's the same mechanism of being judgment. So you're not putting a theological layer on top of this. That's for theologians and biblical scholars, right?
That's right.
Okay. So taking that into consideration, you've seen these movements, these growths, these branches. We all know though that, I mean, you're examining even over time, the best that you can according to the information that you have. And we've seen this shift, and I've seen it time and time again. I've seen it in your research where you've seen a shift in global Christianity over the past 100 years, give or take. But specifically from the global north and the global south. Now, I want us to just take in for a minute, define these two different arenas or spheres, I guess, locations. I'm not even sure what to describe it as. But global north is what regions does that take in, and global south? It's because it's not just a clear line dividing the equator being the dividing line. It's not that clear of a line.
Sadly. So we're using United Nations designations for how we structure the world. I don't decide, for example, how many people live in India. The United Nations puts together in their demographic database every 2 years how many people live in India and all the other countries. My job is to figure out the religious situation of all the people who live in India. So the United Nations divides the world into global north and global south. So the global north is Europe and North America, and the global south is Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Oceania. Now, this is not a perfect way to divide up the world, but we need language to talk about what we're doing. And there has been discernible trends of the shift of Christianity from the global north to the global south. So, for example, in the year 1900, 82% of the world's Christians lived in the global north, Europe, North America, and only 18% lived in the global south. By the year 2020, 33% of Christians lived in the north, and 67% of all Christians today live in the global south. The entire field of world Christianity is predicated on the shift of Christianity to the global south. That's what my predecessor, David Barrett, discovered and quantified for the first time. Something that people had sensed was happening. Ooh, Europe and North America are becoming more secular, but Christianity seems to be growing in Africa and other places. And then David Barrett came along and said, yep, that's true. And here are the numbers that I've come up with to show you that the shift is happening. And from there, the whole field of world Christianity just exploded because people realized and started asking questions. Well, what's the role of Western Christianity if we're not the majority anymore? What does that mean for mission? What does it mean for theological education? What does it mean for money? Where's the money in world Christianity? Where are the resources? The implications of the shift are massive and still being worked out by Christians around the world today.
I'm about to explode with questions. I have so many questions. I have so many questions, Gina. Okay. So with the shift that's going on, this shift, okay, you said 60, what's the percentage now in Global South? 63%? 67%. How many resources, though, does North America have, specifically the United States, in proportion to it? Because we have how many Christians in the global north? Not just the United States, I know.
33%.
33%, and how much of the world's wealth?
How much of Christian wealth? Yeah. A lot of it. A lot of it.
Okay, you gotta be the statistician and you throw out a lot of it. You gotta.
Well, I don't have every number in my head all the time. You want me to look it up in the database? I'll look it up. No, that's okay. But let's just say most of it.
Most of it. Okay, most of it.
That's one of the tensions of world Christianity. Most of the Christians live in the South, but most of the Christian money is still in the North. So what do we do about that?
Oh, that's a great question. Tell us. Is there an answer? No, there's not an answer.
There's no easy ansers.
There are no easy answers. Very complicated. You also mentioned Christian families within a movement. What are these Christian families? That was something that I hadn't seen, so I was curious on what you were talking about when you were writing about this. What are the Christian families within the movement?
Yeah, so the families level is a rather new addition to our taxonomy, which puts together Protestants and independents into discernible families that some people call denominations: Baptists, Methodists, Lutherans, Adventists, all different kinds of groups. So often when people ask, what is your denomination? They expect, oh, I'm Baptist, or oh, I'm Lutheran, or I'm Methodist. Technically, the denomination level for us is, you're not just Baptist, you're American Baptist. You're not just Lutheran, you're Evangelical Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, right? So it's one level lower. But the families level helps answer questions like how many Methodists are in the world? How many house churches are in the world? That level. So it's our attempt to use language that normal people use and understand more clearly.
So how many families are there?
Well, that's a great question. We went back and forth quite a lot to try to figure out how many Christian families they were, and we landed on about 20, but it's a pretty nebulous, line, I think, in some way, because we can define it any way we want. We're the ones making up the taxonomy of world Christianity. So we have a lot of power, frankly, to decide what it's going to be.
It's like, oh, what's it going to be? Being Italian, it kind of sounds a little bit like the mafia. Instead of the 5 families, we have the 20 families. We got the 20 families of Christianity, and we're going to name them.
Don't worry. No one's going to be wearing cement boots at the end of this, so don't worry.
Wow. All right. So let's get focused in on North America just for a moment. I want to move around the world talking about these. What are the fastest growing religions in North America, and well, specifically the United States? Because I know you have Canada and you've got Mexico when we're talking about North America, but let's just zoom in on the United States. What are the fastest growing religions in the United States?
So all religions or just within Christianity?
All religions.
Okay. So if we look at immigration trends, we know that Islam is growing pretty quickly in the United States. And it's not because people are converting to Islam in the USA, it's because of the arrival of Muslims from other places around the world. Now, under recent presidential administrations, that has been lessened, so we're seeing less of that, but I think Islam is definitely on a growth trajectory. But what's also on a growth trajectory is the Pentecostal charismatic movement, both because of people leaving what we call mainline denominations for Pentecostal churches, but also the arrival of immigrants from Latin America. Many of them are Catholic, many of them are Catholic charismatic, or many of them are Pentecostal as well. So both kind of internal switching within Christianity and also the arrival of newcomers to the country.
What are the fastest growing ethnic groups in the United States?
That data I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm going to take an educated guess that it's Latinos.
Okay.
Sure.
Do you know who would be second?
No, I'd have to look that up.
Okay. I was just curious because I know that we're becoming more diverse as a culture. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
And yet there's also been a massive decrease of Christianity within the United States specifically. What are we seeing there from a statistic standpoint?
Yeah, the USA is an outlier in so many different ways, both good and bad. So the United States is the country with the most Christians in the world today and projected to continue to be the country with the most Christians. But the internal dynamics of Christianity are changing. So how can Christianity be declining in the USA, but still be the country with the most Christians? Well, it's because of immigration from Latin America. Most people in Latin America are Christians. So when they cross the border and they come here, that helps bolster the Christian population in the USA. So that means white Christianity is declining the fastest in the United States, but Latina Christianity, even Black Christianity, Asian Christianity has a much more robust staying power than white Christianity appears to have.
And what are the fastest then? I mean, if you're seeing Christianity go down and it still has the world's largest amount of Christians, what's the second largest? Isn't that Brazil or is that Russia? Brazil, because Brazil's grown exponentially. I mean, even in the data that you had the data outlined from 1900 or in the early 1900s. Forgive me if I get the year wrong. And I was amazed at the flip-flop between Brazil. I mean, Brazil, massive surgence up the chart. You had like the top 10 countries of Christianity, and 9 out of 10 were in the global north, if I remember correctly. And then fast forward, and it was like, whoa! I mean, it was a huge shift. So seeing that trend, what does that mean for the church here in the United States going forward?
That's the $1 million question. What is the role of the United States in a world Christianity where Western Christianity is no longer the majority, but the USA is still the country with the most Christians, and the USA is the country that sends the most missionaries overseas, and the USA is home to most of the Christian wealth? Okay, so the USA clearly has a role in the formation of world Christianity in some way, but it can't be what it was. It cannot be the exportation of American culture, combined with mission. It cannot be the exportation of American theological trends along with theological education. And so that's what Christians of the Global South are really critiquing and pushing back against. They're like, we don't want to be American Christians in Brazil. We want to be Brazilian Christians in Brazil. We don't want American theology in the Congo. We want Congolese theology in the Congo. And that is a really hard thing for American Christians to understand, frankly, because like anyone else in the world, we're very American-centric. Everyone where they live is kind of centered on themselves. Thai Christians are Thai-centric. Mongolian Christians are Mongol-centric, right? American Christians are American-centric. But we've just had this history in America of imposing our values on other people and expecting other people to go along with them. But in terms of world Christianity, that era is over. We are not to be exposing other people to our values and expecting them to just wholesale adopt them anymore. That is a colonial narrative that's past, and we need to think of new narratives of partnership and mutual respect and taking a step back for other people to take the spotlight and to take the stage. We need more humility in this new world Christianity.
You just opened up a fire hose, Gina. You just shot everyone with so much information right there. And it was awesome. It was awesome. Talking about colonialization for a moment. And I know some people are like, I don't understand what you're talking about. Basically, the idea is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that as Christianity was transmitted within a lot of missions, they kind of piggybacked off of one another. The colonialization aspect, making colonies of these different places, and the propagation of the faith. Sometimes they worked hand in hand. Sometimes you hear missionaries not liking the colonialization aspect of it because they wanted to disseminate the gospel. So there's good and bad in there. What are the negative impacts, though, of colonialization within these different countries that we still see to this day?
You think I opened up a can of worms? I think you opened up a can of worms, to be totally honest. So it is often stated that Christianity spread around the world, primarily in the 20th century, on the wings of colonization. Christianity, civilization, commerce, and colonization all went hand in hand. And this is kind of the ugly underbelly of the Western missionary movement, because missionaries went along with colonial administrators to all these different places around the world. And most of them were very well-intentioned. They did want to reach people with the gospel. They did want to embed themselves in culture and learn new languages. But they were also products of their time and really could not separate the gospel and what they read in scripture from their European culture or American culture. And so the kind of Christianity that they were introducing to, say, people in sub-Saharan Africa was a Western form of the faith that you didn't actually get from reading the scriptures itself. So they did the incredible work of translating the Bible into local languages, unbelievable efforts. And in doing so, they raised the dignity of these African languages and gave Africans the power to interpret scripture themselves. Like, what's more Protestant than that, right? Sola scriptura, right? We need to be able to translate and understand the Bible for ourselves. And so the Africans, when they read the scriptures for themselves for the first time, they looked at the missionaries and said, why have you kept the real Christianity from us? Because what were they reading in scripture? They were reading about the Holy Spirit coming down. They were tongues of fire, miracles about Jesus and people following Jesus. They saw all these agricultural references that made a lot more sense to them than to my people living in New York City, right? And so all these people encountered this kind of Christianity from the missionaries that didn't really fit. But then they were empowered to find the real Christianity straight from the scriptures, straight from the example of Jesus. And then that's why African Christianity is just so robust today, is because they're interpreting it in ways that make sense for them. So there's the good and the bad of colonialism is there. And I think the legacies of colonialism are still ongoing. The racism, the sexism, the political power moves that happen, all of that is still ongoing, and there's still the ramifications of that you can see all throughout the world. But but the other side of that is the fact that we have authentic forms of Christianity that we might not have had otherwise.
Well, as you mentioned, and we've had this conversation on the show before, every culture has to self-theologize. Now, I know for some people that have been up in the church, they went, wait a minute, What do you mean by that? What do we mean is we have to figure out how to live as Christ followers and interpret the word of God in our specific culture, because we've passed through the Enlightenment, Romantic period. Some of these other cultures in Africa haven't. So when they see the Bible, they're seeing it in the same world that Jesus really did.
Absolutely.
I mean, the pantheon of gods and goddesses, the spirits, all of those different things. So we, in essence, have a harder time. We think it's easier for us, but actually it's easier for them because they don't have all the cultural baggage in some way to deal with, to go back. And so this is where what you're referring to, if I could just be so bold as to elaborate on that. Because I know some of our people are really confused. They're saying, what do you mean Congolese theology? What do you mean a Brazilian theology? Every culture has its theology. There is an American individual. We're very much about the individual in America, whereas other cultures are collectives. So we have to understand that. And that's why we had a great interview on here with Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes. Just to give an idea, because we do read our culture into it, and God transcends it. He does. The gospel finds its embeds in every culture. It's why Jesus came in a culture, right? And incarnate. But as we're talking about this, the idea of self-theologizing and seeing how Europe, the global north, not just Europe, but we're exporting not just the faith, but their culture as well. I want to talk about Europe because it has been the center of so much of our understanding of Christianity. Most of our written church history that is available to us in the West has come from Europeans. As you mentioned, with the Protestant Reformation, we have Martin Luther, we have John Calvin, we have all of these different people. But yet we've seen Christianity decline within, as we've said, the West, not just referring to the United States, but Europe too. How much of a decline are we seeing within European Christianity over the last, few decades?
Yeah, European Christianity is experiencing a very, very fast decline. I think in the post-World War II era in particular is when we saw the fastest decline. But you have to nuance, because I'm a social scientist, you have to nuance what does decline mean? So in our statistics, so if you open up my book and you go to Europe is going to look really Christian still.
Yeah, the numbers were high. I was like, wait, what?
The numbers are a lot higher than what people assume. And the reason for that is because a lot of Europeans still self-identify as Christians in some way. They're baptized into the church, or to be Hungarian is to be Christian, to be British is to be Anglican in some way. But what those figures don't show is belief in God, church service attendance, prayer, how much you tithe, or any other these kind of beliefs and practices of Christianity. Is Jesus the Son of God? So if I were to map, for example, belief in God, that's going to be a very different map than what you have there of self-identification as a Christian. So like looking at France, a lot of French are still Catholic in some cultural way, but only about 5% of French Catholics attend church on any regular basis. So the European religious context is much, much different than the United States because of a long history of the connection between church and state and all that. Secularization looks a lot different there than it does in the United States or in other places. So while the decline narrative is true, I also like to nuance the decline narrative a little bit because
this is good.
I don't want the only thing that people think about European Christianity is decline.
It's not just declining, though. I mean, we have so many immigrants coming in that are
Exactly.
renewing and reviving it. So talk about that for a moment. I'm glad you mentioned that, because we had on the show Daniel Yang, Matt Sorens, and Eric Costanzo in Inalienable.
Yeah.
And how these marginalized churches are renewing, or can renew really the church. And it's my contention that God has brought the nations for one of two reasons. One, to be reached, to hear the gospel, gateway cities, David Garrison, people that have never heard the gospel, have been closed off, have the opportunity to hear that. That's number one. Number two, or to renew or revive. That's the other option. God is doing a work where he is taking these immigrant groups into the churches and renewing and reviving them. We're seeing an increase in Europe. Are we not? And tell us about that, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, so I would say nearly every major European city has immigrant populations there, and a large proportion of them are Christians. If you look at Italy, for example, there are at least 500 congregations of one particular Nigerian denomination and another 500 congregations of one particular Ghanaian denomination. So Nigerians and Ghanaians going to Italy, and they're planting churches all over Italy. And it's just an astounding trend that people really did not anticipate. So the connection between migration and Christianity and mission is huge, and people are doing a lot of research in that area. But we see it all throughout major European cities that the growth of Christianity is happening among people of color, among migrants, and they're from all around the world, bringing a different kind of Christianity than has been known in Europe for the most part.
Well, elaborate on that, because you just freaked out a bunch of people by saying that a different Christianity makes it sound like it's some alien form. Describe what you mean by a different form of Christianity, just to put our audience at ease.
Sure. So most European Christianity is Eastern Orthodox or Catholic or Anglican, right? So kind of high church traditions, very liturgical, very ancient, old traditions. But the kinds of Christianity that are being brought by people from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa, for the most part, it's Pentecostal charismatic Christianity. It's more Protestant theologically, but it's also very exciting. There's a lot going on in Pentecostal charismatic churches. There's exuberant worship, there's miracles that are happening, there's interpretation of tongues and speaking tongues and long worship services and all kinds of things like that. So it's just a different flavor of Christianity than generally you see in Europe.
Well, and the United States. I mean, you mentioned that the church, though, the Latino groups that are coming in, immigrants are changing the face of it. What can our Anglo brothers and sisters, I mean, you and I share same skin color. I mean, we're both Caucasian, and we've grown up, or at least been around. I mean, you've been in New York, I was in Chicago, but you still have a tendency to be around people that look like you. Mm. As I interact with churches, though, I'm trying to show them the benefit and the blessing that they can have by being much more broad, by being much more aware and engaging and inviting to be a people part of it, to invite more leaders to do this, because there's a great blessing in it. What are the great blessings that you see by uniting with other Christians around the world, as well as the challenges?
To me, interacting with Christians from around the world is such a wonderfully biblical thing because, you know, we see in Revelation 7:9, the coming together of the nations, right? Everyone looks different, speaking different languages, and you get kind of a taste of that here, of your interaction with other people. And if you can really see the equality in that all these expressions of Christianity, despite their diversity, are beautiful and good and equal before God, then you're embracing a kind of biblical Christianity that really was the way of Jesus. And that's what we should be doing as Christians, is trying to embrace that level of equality, which plays out in other ways in society. So once you kind of, I guess, humanize people who don't look like you or don't eat the same food you do or speak the language that you do, you humanize the other and you become in relationship with them, then you can work together, right? So let's work together in reaching these refugee populations. Let's work together in helping to make sure girls have an education in this particular place. Let's cross our boundaries to be the church together. That's a really Christian thing to me that I would love to see more of in this country and throughout global Christianity, the intentional boundary crossing for the sake of doing good in the world. That's what it's about for me.
Well, even with us, you hear so much about the Great Commission. I mean, at least in the circles I'm in, there's a lot of people talk about the Great Commission. And it's interesting, though, Jesus never calls it the Great Commission. That's something we've called it. Now, he did talk about the Great Commandment, which is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, to love your neighbor as yourself. But I also think one of the most overlooked parts is John 17, when Jesus in his high priestly prayer prays that they may be one as we are one. And there's the great community is, to me, one of the greatest evangelistic tools in the world. When you have, and I think Acts is really this, is when they show the people crossing their cultural barriers, which otherwise wouldn't, and shows the reality and the magnificence, the power of Jesus. It just overwhelms me. But I want to go back for a moment. I know this is an issue you're very passionate about, talking about the issue of just women in mission and around the world. You have a book that's coming out about this. You also just alluded to the access to education for so many young women, as well as, you didn't mention this, but just, I'm going to throw it out there, doctors, because there's not a lot of women's healthcare providers in certain cultures. We know that's gone on in Afghanistan, where they're building madrasas and there's not hospitals for women and access. We know of female genital mutilation in parts of Africa. You just hear about this gender violence. And yet you're trying to draw attention to this from a global perspective, because women really are the future within Christianity. You see that statistical, if you were to create like a figure, an avatar, if you will, of global Christianity, it would be an African woman.
Yes.
Is that right? So what are the issues that you see facing women in the future of global Christianity right now? And the objections, I mean, everything. Let's just lay it all out there.
Sure, I can summarize a 350-page book on the subject in the next 2 minutes.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Sure.
You just summarize the book. That's the next time you come back. We'll get into that book. But I do know that this is an issue you're passionate about. You just wrote an article for CT about it. I mean, and it was just a really small introduction. But I just think that this is such an area that has been so overlooked, and so many Western Christians are just very ignorant of.
Yeah.
But what do you see in your research?
So the starting place is that, in the words of mission historian Dana Robert, world Christianity is a women's movement. Women have always made up the majority of Christians around the world, from the time of Christ to the present. And I think that very basic demographic fact gets overlooked over and over and over and over again. And I have lots of historical evidence and lots of statistical evidence to support that the female majority of Christianity has consistently been downplayed by the male leaders. Why? Why would you do that? Is it because you're ashamed to admit that your church is majority female? Does it have implications for your denomination or your mission organization or whatever it is, that it's mostly women doing all the work? So there's a lot of gender dynamics and power dynamics at play here, that for the most part, men are running things, but women are the majority. And in being the majority, women are facing unbelievable challenges around the world. Now, there have been great strides, right? More girls are getting education. Fewer women are dying in childbirth. That's all great. But these higher levels of the gender gap, like political participation or becoming leaders of companies or, PhDs, right? There's still tremendous gaps there that it is becoming harder for men and women to be equal in this world, not easier, despite all that work that's been done. And so women are facing challenges from culture, where traditional gendered norms say that the public sphere is for men, the private sphere is for women. They're facing religious expectations, gendered expectations, that the man is the preacher and the wife is the supporter. Or the Bible says X or Y about women, and that's what we've always said, so therefore that's what it's always going to be. So they're facing these obstacles on all sides. And one of the most basic of obstacles that cuts across, no matter where you are in the world, no matter what your culture is, women are not physically safe anywhere in the world. Nowhere. Imagine trying to do anything in this world without having physical safety. I suspect most men don't understand what that's like, to know that you constantly have to be on guard about where you are, what your surroundings are, what you're wearing, who you're around, how long have you been there, what do I have on me, where's the nearest exit, who's the nearest man who can protect me in case something happens, or whatever. That is a whole different way of living than most men understand. Nowhere in the world do women have complete physical safety. And that's something that is not getting talked enough about, I think.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I remember reading a little bit of an article on that, where one woman said, men don't get it. And I don't. I'll fully admit I don't. She goes, I find, though, that men, when they get older and their strength starts to go, that's when they start to get it. And only then do they start to get it, because they realize they're not the most strong person that's there, that someone is stronger. And we had on as a guest missionary by the name of Nick Ripken. And he has just ties all over the world. And Nick said when everything was happening in Afghanistan, and he's talking about different refugees he's interacted with, he was talking about some of these women who had been in refugee camps and overhearing what they said. And it was that it wasn't if they would be raped, it was by who. they would be raped by. I mean, they couldn't even go to a latrine without having to worry about that. And I don't think that we have an understanding of that globally. I mean, even within different cultures, there's so many different things. But when we see Christianity, we see Jesus giving women this really exalted position that I don't think many people realize of how exalted that is. I mean, even having the person that's entrusted with the resurrection, the first news of the resurrection is just, it's incredible. When you start really getting into it, you just see how Jesus empowers and strengthens women. But seeing this around the world, I mean, I don't even know what my question is. I'm overwhelmed just by the knowledge of such violence. I mean, of course, I grew up in a single parent household with a very strong female that was there, and she did her best that she could. And of course, married, and I have 2 daughters as well as 2 sons. And when my daughters are out, you're just aware of that. And I can't imagine different parts around the world. When I hear about like a gang rape in Mumbai, and you hear these men say, well, she deserved it. It's just horrific to think about. And even the woman had an escort, and they beat him up, and they went, well, he wasn't strong enough. That's her fault. Are you kidding me right now? It's just horrific.
And I will say the situation's not much better in Christian context and in churches, by the way. Yeah. So we can't assume that because a place is Christian, that this problem has been solved or addressed. One example of this is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is 95% Christian, but was named the rape capital of the world in 2010. How can a majority Christian country treat its women so poorly? That is a structural sin and a structural problem that needs to be addressed. This is not some individual bad apples. There are structural problems going on there where women are literally considered biologically second-class citizens, and not just in society, but also the church. And this is not just an issue for Congolese Christians. It's an issue for American Christians too, who have certain theologies that place women as second-class citizens as well. And that kind of theology is getting exported in other places around the world. I'm hearing it from places in Europe, for example. I was talking to a guy from Sweden. Sweden's one of the most wonderful places to live in the world, especially from a gender dynamics. Women can do pretty much anything men can do in Sweden. And he said that some of the more conservative theologies from the United States about gender relations are being exported to Sweden and challenging generations of women's empowerment there. And he was so discouraged by it. And he said, what are you guys doing in your country? And I was like, I don't know. I don't know. So this is not just a problem for, quote, over there. This is a problem for at home too.
Well, even then, the cases, different denominations releasing their abuse reports that have been out there. I mean, whether it's sexual abuse, whether it's physical violence, whether it's emotional and even spiritual abuse, these are things that we have to talk about as Christ followers, because as Christ followers, we should be open and authentic about what we're dealing with. And when I hear people say, oh, they're Christian, I'm glad that you expect something higher of them. But at the same time, we have sinful natures, and sometimes the spiritual language that we employ is just used to hide a sinful behavior, and that is not acceptable. And to Christ, it's an insult to Christ. It's really an insult to Christ. Moving in a different direction, if I might, for a moment. One of the regions that you talk about, I mean, we've talked about the explosion of Christianity. You mentioned Latin America and how so many Christians are coming in. We talked a little bit about Brazil. We talked about Europe. We talked about Africa and Asia and Europe, which, by the way, I never know where to do with Russia. Gina, tell me what to do with Russia. Is it European or is it Asian?
It's European, even though most of its country is geographically in Asia, but most of the people live closer to Europe, if that helps.
Yeah, it does, but it always makes me mad because I'm like, wait, where are the lines? Who determines this?
I know.
But I want to talk about, you mentioned Oceania for a moment, Oceania, which that's not an area people talk about very often. And you've made great effort. You mentioned it in your article on CT. You mentioned it in the conversation. It seems like this is a new area of discovery for you personally, and you've written and want to share that with other people. I want to hear more about this. What has brought this out that and you think we should hear from, and what God is doing there?
Yeah, I really love that you asked this question. Thank you. Because what we're doing is Christianity in every country of the world. truly global, the most global attempt, every country, meaning every island nation that you've never heard of. That's what we're all about. It's global or bust. And there's all these island nations in the Pacific Islands that most people have never heard of. French Polynesia, Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, just a lot of places that seem insignificant, frankly, either because you can't see them on a map, most maps, it's hard to see these tiny places, or because their populations are really small. So they're just kind of far removed from the discourse. But what's interesting to me about the Pacific Islands in particular, there's two things. One, the Pacific Islands became Christian by a partnership model between Western missions and indigenous Christians. So Christianity was introduced to the islands in a particular place and time. People became Christians, and then from one island to the next, Christianity moved. Over a really short amount of time, over the 19th and early 20th century, the Pacific Islands became majority Christian. And from a percentage perspective, the Pacific Islands are more Christian than Sub-Saharan Africa. We talk about Sub-Saharan Africa all the time, but we never talk about the Pacific Islands. So that's one reason it's interesting, because there's this fabulous partnership model of mission that existed there that was completely overlooked by the Western missionary movement in its analysis of it. The other thing that's interesting about the Pacific Islands that I think we need to be looking towards them more is the climate crisis. These island nations are pretty much at sea level or really close to sea level, and they feel the impacts of climate change disproportionate to their own actions. So it's the actions of the USA, China, India, huge countries, USA being the country with the most Christians, right? We should have a moral responsibility to care for Christians elsewhere in the world. Things that we do in the United States impacts these people in the Pacific Islands. So that when the tide comes in, it covers their cemeteries. It comes into their churches and renders them unusable until the tide goes back out. They are literally trying to decide if they should just all go to New Zealand in some of these places, because they see that their entire country and societies and cultures and histories are at risk of extinction. So we're looking at the extinction of Christian peoples in the Pacific Islands, and we're still having a debate in the United States if climate change is real. So if we want to be globalists and we want to be global Christians, we have to look at how what we do impacts other people around the world. And the Pacific Islands is one of the best examples of that.
I've heard stories of people having to move their island, leave their home because it was, I just didn't realize and put it in that type of context. That's very sobering, very sobering. Yes. Talking about Oceania for a minute, is it Oceania or Oceania?
Either way, you can.
Well, I'm sure they have a preference. I want to make sure I get it right, but that's okay.
I say Oceania is what I say.
Oceania. Okay. Potato. Yeah. It's one of those. But looking at the countries, you mentioned these different countries. One of the things that I was really blown away by, and I have a huge question for you on this. I want to make sure I get my data right. You mentioned there are 233 countries plus Kosovo. But yet, when I look at, according to the member states of the United Nations, there's like 195, 96, 97 in there, that number. How do we miss 37-ish countries? What classifies as a country?
So we're using the United Nations Demographic Database, which has a slightly different list than that list you were looking at of UN member states. So the demographic database is using a different definition of what a country is. And in fact, since my book came out last September, the UN population revision came out, and now there's 237 countries in the world. So there's actually a few more than what's in that book, which is just the unfortunate consequence of doing the demography of religion, that it's constantly changing. So they have their own idea of what a country is and what a country isn't. But so, for example, between the 234 and 237, there was the Caribbean Netherlands was a group of 3 islands, and they broke out into individual islands, countries, according to the UN. So sometimes it's just small changes like that. If Scotland ever decides to break away from the UK, they'll be their own independent country. And so there's all these kind of geopolitical realities going on all around the world all the time. And we just watch to see what the tipping point is when they get recognized by the UN.
Being in the United States and having your finger on the pulse of these things, like you just mentioned a little bit, we talk about sub-Saharan Africa all the time. Most people I know don't talk about sub-Saharan Africa, but within your group, I understand that.
My people do.
Your people do all the time. What, though, do you find that most Western Christians don't see that you wish they could see?
I wish they could see how authentic Christian faith is around the world, even when it doesn't look like your Christian faith. That is still the major hurdle of being a global Christianity scholar. Is there's still this work to be done of convincing Western Christians that other expressions of Christianity are just as legitimate as yours, that other interpretations of scripture are just as legitimate as yours, that other ideas of gender roles are just as legitimate as yours. We're still at the level of legitimacy, which is too bad, because I feel like we should be much further along in this conversation, because the shift of Christianity to the global South didn't just happen yesterday. This has been a long time coming. And if we've been paying close attention, we should have the legitimacy question checked off and moved on to the mutual understanding conversation, the dialogue conversation, the work together conversation, the mutual witness conversation. But to me, we're still at legitimacy of people asking, well, is that kind of Christianity real? Let me give you an example I just heard the other day. So in Uzbekistan, which is a Muslim majority country, Christians there recently became large enough that the government allowed them to build a church building. Great. So the Uzbek Christians are building or have these plans to build a church, and a German church finds out about these plans and wants to partner with the Uzbeks and help fundraise and give money to build this new Uzbek church. So Germans come and the Uzbeks show them the plan for the church, and the Germans are like, that's a mosque. And the Uzbek Christians are like, no, it's a church in Uzbek style. And the Germans look at it again and say, it's a mosque. And the Christians say, no, it's a church in Uzbek style. It's a church that makes cultural sense for us. And the Germans pulled out because they didn't want to be a part of a church that they thought looked like a mosque. But it's not up to the Germans what kind of church the Uzbek Christians build. It's up to the Uzbeks to decide what kind of church the Uzbeks build. There's all kinds of social and historical and cultural reasons why that Uzbek church that they designed themselves would look the way it looks. And that's the level of legitimacy that we're still working at. Christians should be able to build whatever kind of church looks right and feels right to them. They should be able to speak and worship in whatever language and whatever musical style, wearing whatever clothes makes sense for them, without any Westerner telling them it's right or wrong. That's where we're at, and that's what I want people to know.
Where is Christianity growing the most, by the way? The most exciting developments that you've seen and that inspires you? I mean, we can talk about the obstacles and then get really frustrated and get our and we should, I mean, frankly, but sometimes I need to have a positive example to look at.
Sure.
To get some joy.
Yeah.
Where do you find joy in global Christianity right now?
I find joy in the places where Christianity is getting to the place where Indigenous Christians are saying, thank you to all the people who helped us become Christian. We're going to take it from here and we're going to figure out how to be Christian on our own terms. So an example of this is Mongolia. The church in Mongolia is really young, only since the post-Soviet era in the early 1990s. There was, I think, 4 known Christians in 1991, 4 in the whole country. That's a very small number.
1991?
Yes, in our lifetimes, right? That's astounding. And the church has grown dramatically. Now there's like 60,000 Christians in Mongolia. And now they're getting to the point where they're saying, okay, we don't want to be Christian the way the Koreans are telling us to be Christian. Lots of Korean missionaries in Mongolia. We don't want to be Christian the way the Americans are telling us to be Christian. A lot of Americans in Mongolia. We want to be Christian in Mongolian ways. And it's like the first century church over there as a result, right? This is the stuff of the New Testament of figuring out how to be Gentile and Christian, how to be Jewish and Christian, how to be Mongolian and Christian, how to be Nepalese and Christian, how to be Cambodian and Christian. So there's places in the world where these conversations are happening, and that is where I find joy in world Christianity. It's that indigenous initiative to say, we love and respect all of you who have helped us, but please let us figure this out on our own, in our own way. And as long as people say, okay, good, do it. And if you need help, we're here for you. But that initiative, that indigenous initiative, that's the stuff of world Christianity that I get excited about.
Well, where do you find that at? Like, where do you find the biggest indigenous Christian movements right now where it's exploding?
So India is a big place for this, where we have movements or Hindu background believer movements, as they're called, where people are doing a lot of experimenting about what it means to be Indian and Christian. And there's a huge spectrum of theology that goes along with that, from people building Western style churches all the way to Christian movements within Hinduism, where people publicly retain their Hindu identity, but privately they are Christ followers. So on that spectrum, you see all kinds of things. And there's movements in India, and Bangladesh is a pretty significant place for these kinds of movements. But again, there's these legitimacy questions that are happening because a lot of Westerners don't like it. But it's not up to the West for Indians to decide how they're going to be Christian. It's up to Indians how they're going to be Christian.
When you say that, what do you mean by that? Flesh that out for us just for a moment, because you've alluded to that a few times. The legitimacy, Western Christians determine whether or not it's legitimate. What are the criteria that you find that most Westerners employ when they look to determine whether legitimacy happens in these indigenous cultures?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. So they're looking for what they understand to be quote unquote orthodox theology. They're looking for the centrality of scripture. Is what are the decisions you're making for how your church is going to look or how your movement's going to look? Are they biblically based or are they culturally based? And that's where part of the rub is, because Westerners try to differentiate religion and culture. But that's not how it works in most of the world. Religion and culture are so intricately bound. What is Hindu and what is Indian, right? What is, and you can apply that to all kinds of places, right? What is shamanistic and what is Mongolian? It's almost impossible to tell, right? But then there's also other things that some Western organizations look for, such as if a particular movement is led by women, they don't consider it a movement. Or if a house church is led by a woman, they don't consider it a real church. It has to be led by a man in order for it to be considered a church. That is very problematic because many of these movements are led by women, because generally women are more likely than men to convert to Christianity. So that gender dynamic is a really big piece of this.
Why do you think that we're seeing so many women? I mean, is there anything, I know this is hard to quantify, but you mentioned women are more likely to convert than men. Why do you think that is, in your personal opinion?
Yeah, I think when Christianity is done well, it's abundantly obvious the benefits that exist for women because of the example of Jesus. Jesus intentionally reached out to women. He used metaphors that women would understand on a different level than men would use. He said, let the children come to me. And in most places of the world, women are the ones taking care of the children. He didn't bring shame onto the woman at the well. He brought her honor, right? In restoring her honor, despite whatever her life circumstances were. So there's all kinds of examples. If you know Jesus supported women. And so you go into these societies, whether they're sex segregated in some way or women are considered second-class citizens, their testimony is not worth as much as a man's, and you come in with the message of Jesus saying, Jesus treats you with honor and integrity and empowerment and cares about you and you specifically, not just as a human, but you specifically as a woman. That's a really appealing message. And then if we create Christian community around that, women are generally communal and are empowered by other women, and you create these communities of women of faith. So that's one reason why and women tend to be a little more relational. So if you have people coming into a place, women might be more likely to build relationships with them faster than men. And all mission is relational, right? It's not just proclamation. Mission, when done well, is relational. It's about personal relationship with Christians that leads to a personal relationship with Jesus.
There's just so much. Looking not just at the relational aspect, actually, I want to shift gears. I know we're coming near to the end of our time. Secularization. Let's talk about that just for a moment. Because secularization, so many different Western missions ideas brings this idea of modernity when they go to do mission. They think if I have food and shelter and all these different things, but at the same time, when secularization comes in, you see a shift culturally. I know Philip Jenkins has written about this in his work. What role does secularization play within I don't want to say the constricting of the faith? What is secularization doing to our faith? Perhaps that's a better question. Globally, that's a big question, I know.
Yeah, and it's very complicated and contested. So a lot of social scientists are looking into secularization now. That's kind of the latest and greatest in religious studies. And there's a lot of different ideas about how secularization works. And the Europe situation has been studied pretty closely, but the models of European secularization don't work in the United States. And for example, the USA never really had a state church, right? The way that Catholicism and Orthodoxy were and other churches were state churches. So the secularization processes are going to look different there. And so now some people are trying to find out, what does secularism look like in the global South? Is there any secularism in the global South? Because if you look around, it looks like a pretty furiously religious place, religions of all kinds, not just Christianity. But the problem is they're still trying to use Western models of secularism and apply them in non-Western places. And it's just not working. So I have yet to see, in my opinion, some really convincing studies of secularism in the global South from the perspective of those cultures, not taking the Western model and trying to find it somewhere in the global South. That's not going to work. So we have to understand that Indian secularization, if it is occurring, is going to occur in a different way than French secularization happened or British secularization happened. But the field isn't quite there yet. The scholarship has not quite moved in that direction. But what some people think about how secularism impacts Christian faith, one thing secularism does is it makes faith more private. And that's one definition of secularism, is that religion is no longer the public central organizing structure of a society. Now it's more internal, it's more private. And some people think that when religion goes private, you have maybe more authentic versions of faith, because now there's no public expectation for you to go to church or publicly identify as Christian or tithe or whatever. So those who are still doing it are really, really Christian. Like they're doing it because they're personally motivated and they feel personally indebted to the faith in some way. So people think of it as some kind of like refiner's fire kind of thing, that all the quote nominal people are gone. What's left is kind of the faithful remnant. That's how some people are understanding secularization. But again, globally, we can't assume that those models are going to hold.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's really complicated.
It is. Well, I mean, all of these issues are complicated.
Yeah.
All these issues are complicated because you're talking about humans, and there's as soon as we put a category on someone, it becomes different, because the categories that we employ here in the West are within our tribes of familiarity. Let's say when you put a label on someone, they might eschew that label. They might reject that label because they themselves don't like the way that you've qualified it. And I think that's what makes it a lot more of a struggle for so many of our people that are non-academics. It just becomes overwhelming the state, the data, the statistics, and it comes down to, let's just follow Jesus. Can we just follow Jesus? And while I understand not everyone is going to be a scholar of your magnitude, we still need you though. We need
Thank
this.
you.
We need this. Not that you needed my inner thing on it. You
I'm
didn't
so
need
glad.
anything. But what I mean is for our people is that I want them to understand how needed and necessary your work is. Because it does help us to understand. I'm a big believer in find out where God is working and join him in that. And I also am enough of a Bible student to know that God doesn't work according to my categories. He has a way of doing things outside of my comfortability. I mean, even look at the New Testament with Mary. I mean, even Mary, just the Magnificat, her being pregnant, it was right on the line of acceptability and cultural and understanding. I do know that God is sovereign in the middle of all this. And despite the magnitude of the discussion that we've had today and the overwhelming nature of these statistics and trying to quantify and qualify all these different things, we do know at the end of the day that Jesus Christ is God and that he is going to do his will and in his way. And we want to join him in that and partner with our brothers and sisters around the world and that are being persecuted, where the church is growing, and how we can help one another and learn from one another and be students and listen to our brothers and sisters. One of the reasons we chose Apollos as our namesake is because Apollos, after he gets converted in such a weird way, hearing about John, the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist, that's not your typical conversion sermon. And he starts to preach. But then when Priscilla and Aquila hear him, they pull him aside to explain the way of God more accurately. And he listened. He listened. And so we want to listen to our brothers and sisters around the world to be able to partner with them and learn from them, because I think our vision of God grows when we hear from our brothers and sisters. We see God through their eyes and what he's done in his world, in their world, and we see that he's a lot bigger than we ever give him credit for. I want to thank you for coming on the show. How can, oftentimes we try to give people a water bottle for the week, something for them to sip on. What's an encouraging thought that we could leave for our audience today that they might be able to just ruminate on and be nourished by?
One thing that has been really encouraging to me is on this discussion of women in world Christianity, despite all the challenges that women are facing, they are amazing warriors overcoming them. You put a challenge in front of women, they're going to find a way to overcome it. And I've been really encouraged that even when it might seem impossible, there's all these faithful Christian women around the world who are doing the impossible. So I would encourage people in that.
And how can people follow more about what you're doing?
Yeah, so our website is globalchristianity.org, and we have a Facebook page, Twitter, Instagram. You can follow us there. We have a newsletter that we put out every once in a while. So feel free to follow us on social and check out all the free resources available on our website.
And there's a lot. I mean, there's so many different stats on there. I've used some of them and passed it around, and then it gets people pass it around to other people. It's an encouragement. I want to thank you for coming on Apollos Watered. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being so passionate about these issues and drawing our attention to it so that we might hopefully grow in our understanding of God and be able to just partner with him in what he's doing around the world. Thank you again for coming on Apollos Watered.
Thank you. It's been fun.